This entire section is all about building layouts. And so before we actually start doing that, let's talk about what layout actually means and also the three major ways in which we can build layouts in CSS right now. So in web design and web development, when we say layout, what we mean is basically the way that text, images, and all the other content is placed and arranged on the web page. So here on the right side, I have an example of a very simple website, and there are a couple of pieces of content, and clearly they are arranged in a certain way, right? And so again, the way in which they are arranged and placed here on this website is the layout of the design, essentially. So the layout gives this page what we call a visual structure, and then into that structure we can place the content. Now, one of the main jobs as front-end developers, so as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript developers, is to build layouts, which is the reason why we have an entire section on building layouts alone. So according to this definition of layout, building a layout means to arrange page elements into some kind of visual structure instead of simply having all of our elements, so all of our content, basically placed one after another. Just imagine that in this example website, all these 7 pieces of content would simply be laid out one after the other. That wouldn't look very interesting visually, right? And it also would make a lot harder to actually understand the content that is being transmitted here. So layout exists for a reason, because it makes our sites easier to understand and also makes it visually more pleasing. Now, there are basically 2 types of layouts, which are page layout and component layout. So page layout is basically what I've been talking about up until this point, which is laying out the elements, so the big pieces of content inside of a web page or a website. Now, on the other hand, these bigger page layouts are themselves made of components like this one. And these components themselves need to have some kind of layout, because these components themselves are made out of smaller pieces of content which also need to be arranged in some kind of way. And so we can say that components themselves also have a layout. So once again, we wouldn't want to have these 12 pieces of content simply laid out one after another, right? That wouldn't make a lot of sense. And so therefore, we also need to give the smaller components some kind of layout. Okay, so now that we know what layouts are and what type of layouts we can build, now let's see how we can actually build them with CSS. And the first technique of building layouts in CSS is using float layouts, which is basically the old way of building layouts using the float CSS property. Now, these types of layouts are quickly getting replaced by newer technologies such as Flexbox and CSS Grid, but in some cases they are still being used, and especially on older websites. So we will still learn how to build float layouts just so you know how they work in case you ever see one at some point in your career, for example, when you're working on an older website. But for the main part, we will then quickly move on to one of the newer ways of building layouts, which is using Flexbox. So Flexbox is one of the modern ways of laying out elements, and in the case of Flexbox, it is perfect for building one-dimensional layouts. So basically a layout which is just a row, and all without using floats. So Flexbox might be perfect for simpler component layouts, just like we saw in the last slide. Then the other modern way of laying out elements is CSS Grid. So with CSS Grid, we can actually build complete 2-dimensional layouts, which is perfect for big page layouts and also more complex components like the one that we saw in the last slide. So Flexbox and CSS Grid have completely revolutionized the way in which we build layouts in CSS right now. And so we will spend most of the course learning them and using them in our big website project later. But for now, let's actually start quickly learning float layouts in the next lecture.